Hello EU4 players, my name's Riemann, and welcome to the fourth and final video of the War Academy. Is it just me, or has this series gone on for a long time? Anyways, in this episode I'll discuss some more advanced topics of warfare, including many techniques skilled players use to maximize the usefulness of their army, as well as a discussion on the overall philosophy you should have towards warring in general. To start with, let's begin with the scenario of being faced by a larger opponent. Wars like this can be unavoidable at some points, especially early in the game. While this is a bad position to be in, you do have some methods at your disposal to even the odds. Many of these methods are useful even if you're not facing a superior enemy, but they can be especially useful or necessary when you are. To start, here are some tips for fighting when outnumbered. Tip 1. Practice good army micro. An excellent scenario to train yourself in is to fight Muscovy as Kazan 1 vs 1 in 1444. Important things to learn include how to pick off straggler armies, the importance of regiment consolidation, how movement lock constrains the AI's ability to respond, especially in areas of the map where provinces are larger, the benefits and limitations of forts along with the concept of siege racing, fighting in favorable terrain, and when to give ground at the tactical level to secure a long-term strategic advantage. The Kazan vs Muscovy scenario nicely exaggerates the importance of all of these. At first, the odds might seem daunting. Muscovy and its vassals have well over twice the amount of troops that you do. However, you have the advantages of being a horde, having a gold mine, not having to deal with vassals, and possessing a human brain. EU4 isn't that complicated at the tactical level, so with a bit of practice, you should be able to pull this off with a fair degree of consistency. I'll put a link in the description if you want to watch this full war from the perspective of a skilled player. Tip 2. Take as many loads as necessary. A key element of efficient play is understanding just how far this game will let you over-leverage yourself. A good rule of thumb is that if you're running a surplus when your maintenance sliders are at full, then you're only tapping into about 30 to 50% of your military potential. A victory, even at high cost, can often lead to getting money from your enemy to pay off those loans, or at the very least it can provide a truce timer long enough for you to go into a managed bankruptcy, which can be a powerful tool in its own regard. One rather stark example of this is Byzantium versus the Ottomans in 1444. By hammering the loan button like there's no tomorrow, it's actually possible to create an army large enough to defeat the main Ottoman battle stack on even terms. And from here, it's possible to siege down forts and gain enough war score to secure a good peace deal in a 1v1 war before going bankrupt. This isn't the best Byzantium strat out there, but it's something to keep in mind as a general principle. If an early war is a life or death struggle, then you have no reason not to go into as much debt as necessary. The loan tank is insanely deep in EU4, and as such, it's certainly something you should take advantage of. Tip 3. Trap enemies in straight crossings. One of the most notable aspects of military geography are the gaps where land units can traverse bodies of water without boats. It's often possible to bait the AI into a trap with these using a small army of your own. Once the enemy is in a position like this, you have two options. First, you can attack them, as a victory will lead to a guaranteed stack wipe. Alternatively, if those troops aren't going to cause a problem on that side of the strait, you can instead opt to just leave them there. This ensures the AI won't rebuild its troops to refill that force limit, removing that army from the war indefinitely. Tip 4. The vassalization trick. This one is more of an exploit than the rest, but it's been in the game long enough and has been a feature of enough strats to merit its inclusion in this list. What you do first is gather as many allies as you can, then wait for your target enemy to declare war on some small nation. Then, declare war on that small nation yourself, and vassalize it before your target enemy has won. Upon vassalization, you'll be dragged into your vassal's war, the war with your target nation, with a single important caveat that it counts as a defensive war, not an offensive one. This fact gives a huge boost to your allies accepting the call to arms, allowing you to pull in tons of help, which can easily overwhelm your enemy. Tip 5. Rush early military tech. If you remember back to my second video in the series, I had a chart that detailed the relative advantage of having a one-tech lead. While it's always a great idea to push for a military tech advantage if you can, it's especially pronounced early in the game. Being on Tech 4 while your enemy is on Tech 3 can turn a tough war into a series of lopsided stack wipes in your favor, while being on Tech 6 while your enemy is on Tech 5 is akin to having a discipline advantage well in excess of 30%. Because Miltech is so critical early on, a standard move for many nations is to put their first national focus on military points, and to hire at least a level 1 military advisor, even if they start in a tough economic situation. Finally, tip 6. If you can't win outright, understand that a stalemate will eventually give you victory. The mechanics of the game are set up such that the AI is very poorly suited to long conflicts. Hence, as long as you can set up a sustainable status quo, you can win basically anything. A good example of this is the 100 Years' War. This is one of the more well-known difficult fights in EU4, but it can actually be fairly easy and laid back if you know what you're doing. First, I give my continental provinces to vassals so I don't get ticking war exhaustion when they get occupied. Then, when the war starts, I make the conscious decision not to engage the enemy on the mainland where they have a significant advantage. Instead, I focus on Scotland and stack wiping any enemies that navally invade England. And then, I just sit. The reason this works is that war enthusiasm is largely predicated on the length of war modifier, which makes allies unwilling to continue in the war after a period of time. After about 7 years, the enemy's allies are willing to agree to a white peace, despite the fact that I had never engaged with most of them. After I secure a military tech advantage, I simply stroll into Paris uncontested and win the war easily. Now, the downside of the stalemate strategy is that it takes time, which is often the ultimate resource in strategy games. Normally, you'd never want to wait this long to win a single war, as I was mostly just dragging it out for demonstrative purposes. However, if you have time to spare and are in a position that makes this strat feasible, then stalemating is a reliable, low-stress way to win wars when outnumbered. Another example of where this strat can work is in the Second War against the Ottomans, where you can block the straits and let their war exhaustion balloon by occupying their European provinces. It also works as Japan fighting against the Ming, where you can get war exhaustion ticking from blockades. With those tips being said though, it should be noted that, in general, there's actually not a lot of crazy things you can do to win wars if you have a large disadvantage. EU4 is primarily a strategy game, not a tactics game. Unless you have a specific geographic or diplomatic setup that gives you an ace up your sleeve, getting declared on by a nation with 3 times your force limit really isn't winnable no matter how good you are. The Kazan vs Muscovy example I listed earlier is towards the upper limit of what good players can do through raw tactical skill alone. Newer players might get the wrong impression by watching some streams or videos, where a player wins against all odds against some massive enemy. While that's exciting and makes for good video content, that is not the norm of what you should seek to do on a consistent basis. A far better strategy is to seek to win wars efficiently. Good players win wars, while great players win wars swiftly and at little expense. Wars can roughly be divided onto a continuum between blitzkriegs and slogs. Blitzkriegs are where you siege down all the enemy's forts as quickly as possible, with only occasional fighting, whereas slogs are the wars that come down to a battle of resources between the two sides, with lots of fighting draining the resource pools of both nations until one side loses the ability to resist. The efficient play is to avoid the second type of war as much as possible, and focus instead on the low-hanging fruit where you can win easily without much exertion. Just because you could win a war against a roughly equal opponent doesn't mean you should try. In terms of expanding yourself, the trick to efficient warring is to simply attack nations that are weaker than you. These could be smaller nations, those without allies, those being attacked by other countries, those that are bankrupt, etc. In doing so, not only will you win battles consistently by bringing more troops to bear, you can also find yourself rarely having to fight at all. The AI has been extremely skittish in the past several patches, and it will often abandon its country altogether to go see some stuff far away, which means you can win with very few casualties taken. Another trick to efficient warring is that you almost always want to plan wars such that they'll result in total victory. There are very few places for partial wars in this game. You almost always want to fight until you can take 100 war score worth of stuff. Wars tend to cascade in ways that make the second half easier and less resource intensive than the first half. Combining this with other phenomena like truce efficiency means it's typically worthwhile to prosecute wars until you win decisively. When you're fighting an enemy with little strategic depth, you should defeat their army as quickly as possible and then follow up by trying to stack wipe it wherever it shatters to. Don't let the enemy freely replenish their losses. catch them on the back foot and strike them down so they cannot get back up. If transporting your troops via boats or getting access treaties through other nations allows you to go for the stack wipe, you should do so. At the same time, you should place at least one regiment on each enemy province so they can't recruit new units. It's alright if you can't start sieging things just yet. Focus first on eliminating their ability to counterattack. Then you can focus on sieging down their forts to bring the war to a conclusion. If you do this all correctly, these wars should be very cheap, as in under 10,000 men lost combined to both battle and attrition. These wars won't cost you much even if you do things inefficiently, but the difference between an easy war taking, say, 8,000 casualties and taking 16,000 casualties snowballs and adds up over the course of a campaign. Next, let's talk about wars where your primary target is a large nation. In general, you should do wars against the big guys either in the first 20 years of the game, or wait until at least the 17th century after you get access to absolutism. Some countries like Byzantium, Navarra, or the European hordes face an immediate existential threat without many easy ways to escape. In that case, if they want to retain their homeland, then they'll have to make use of the tips I detailed at the start of the video. Going for an early kneecapping of the Ottomans or Castile or Muscovy can be useful and even necessary for some starts. But if it isn't, you should wait until later in the game when you can take much more land. It just isn't worthwhile to plow into the Ottomans in 1550. Yes, a good player will probably win the war, but it will be very resource intensive, and in the end you'll only gain a dozen provinces or so. There are some exceptions to this rule with certain mission trees, or with specific mechanics like the Mandate of Heaven or the Holy Roman Empire, but generally it's better to exclusively prioritize the low-hanging fruit until you get to absolutism if it's feasible to do so. When you do go to war, note that even if you're much larger than them, wars against big nations can still take a disproportionate amount of effort. I still worry about facing an Ottomans with 2,000 development even when I have 10,000 development, because the AI can still easily attain local superiority by death stacking all its units at one portion of the front. These wars tend to come down to monitoring where your enemy is massing its troops and responding with your own as you slowly peel back each layer of forts. You'll have to fight the same armies over and over again because rushing in for stack wipes isn't an option. Getting temporary allies for these wars can be very helpful, not necessarily because they'll contribute much military prowess, but rather to distract enemy troops. The AI likes to allocate its forces to focusing down weaker nations, so getting someone to serve as siege bait on the opposite side of your enemy can make the first parts of the war easier. When you eventually win the war, it's very important that you take the right provinces since you won't be able to annex them all at once. You don't want to take big cohesive chunks of their empire. Rather, you want to spread tentacles reaching as far into their lands as possible, prioritizing taking forts when the opportunity presents itself. This lets you shatter their strategic depth, disproportionately making subsequent wars much easier relative to how much development you actually deprive them of. The deeper you reach, the more maneuverability you'll have in the next war, and the more forts you'll be able to siege in parallel. The tentacles will also serve as an early warning system for where enemy troops are heading, it'll give the AI difficulty in dealing with rebels, and it'll give a place to quickly replenish depleted regiments. It may seem silly to engage in the border war of chopping a country to ribbons, but rest assured that it is the optimal way to play. So, thanks for watching this series. There are certainly some topics that could be covered in further depth, which I may do at some point. I ended up cutting a lot of content to just focus on the most important stuff, otherwise this series would have been 3 times longer than its already bloated size. Nevertheless, I hope it's given you insight into how warfare works in EU4, and how to improve at it. Until next time, my name's Riemann, and thanks for watching.